Turn on.
Cause the weakest man see how he
Tune in.
The Satanist, the black magician, is not seeking that kind of
No, I think we're very control. When we keep the calculations, more or less,
You certainly killed the fire.
I did nothing.
Carrying me around, so I know he's got that.
You never did know at that time that box
That's my second
they put 20 years on it. I was the one that received it for you.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Experience.
Well, thank you, Al. Thank you.
Anyway,
Thanks for it. I mean,
instructions are on the back.
I'm very serious about it. I thought that
I
was
like to, yeah.
Well, what did you do for her?
Interstitial was a box of marijuana, snuff box full, give him 30 years for it.
Yeah.
I said, that's entirely wrong. We're
Well,
like
anyway, I hope to be able to do something.
You were acting in his behalf.
Oh, yeah.
Well, don't give up, because I've done 44 months on it, I'm still out of 10 years road. So listen, don't give up. The case is still alive, you know.
We'll just stay out of jail. That'll be something.
Listen, I need you now more than ever.
Hey, what is
Right when I learned the parole board.
Listen, when did you two guys meet?
Oh, 20, 30 years ago.
That was nonsense.
20 years ago, wasn't it?
What?
That was about 1960, 61. When you went to Harvard.
back at Harvard, 1961, maybe.
When he came to visit Harvard, when that the first time too.
Yeah, that's the first time I met him.
1660.
They gave me,
Years ago, I said, depends on whether you can't high or can't low.
I gave him a tablet of 500, a bottle of 500 tablets.
I remember that.
Take it all at once.
Just go hotter and hotter and hotter.
Well,
Didn't you say that you introduced Tim to CO2?
yeah, so that's right.
I think I did.
That's right. He dragged us all around Boston with these tanks, and we had people loading in the tanks, and he had us all strapped with the...
Well, it's still the best stuff.
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah. Never go to a...
Hardly wait to get it again. Busy businessman's LSD.
Well, I'd like to say, just in general, I'm taking more LSD now than I ever have before, at least once a week, and I find that it's working better than ever.
It's a tonic, isn't it?
Yeah.
You look very well.
The new experimental forms are even better, so...
Yeah?
I just wanted to get some attention.
That's the commercial.
Well,
Now I can go back to the primetime program.
I must just fly around that, because otherwise, if I don't do this, I'll be killed.
well, listen, so what has it done, actually, through all the years? A great clarity of vision, a great clarity of mind.
If he'd never seen me, he'd have been better off.
Great perception.
Oh, Al, I don't say that. I owe everything to you.
I think you would have. I think you would have.
Galactic Center has sent you down just at the right moment.
Yeah, to create a disturbance.
Well, yeah, she likes disturbance.
Well, gentlemen, what do you think's going to happen to it all, really? Do you think we're going to get it back in some form that we might be able to use it effectively or under proper control or what have you?
You're talking about bureaucracy and government? My wife and I use more LSD now than I ever did in the past, and sensible people are still doing it.
Yeah.
And what happens in Sacramento, or in Washington, or in Beijing, or in Saigon, it's never affected us and never will.
Well, you certainly warn them out. There's no use in them bothering you anymore.
What? Oh,
There's no use in them bothering you anymore.
I don't mind being bothered.
No, you seem to be indestructible.
Well, when you started with it all, Al, Al did, but you started with it all. I mean, You had some kind of a purpose or vision in mind then, didn't you?
I still got it.
Yeah, well, and you...
I'm in my mind.
And you're responsible for carrying it, you know, you're the Johnny Appleseed of LSD, you know, planting it everywhere you got a chance.
Well, I sure did, but I don't think it was a credit thing. It was credit. I think something should have been done, and I tried to do it. And I'm still trying to do it.
Yeah. Okay. And why? Why, Al? Why are you trying to do it?
I don't know.
What are you doing it for?
Well, I don't know. Just, I think it's a thing to do. Who else could an old guy my age do it's worth anything?
You're looking for some sort of motives, I gather.
No. What I'm looking
like Freudian motives?
No,
political motives?
I was just wondering.
Economic motives? Or
No, I was wondering because I thought that Al had some really personal interest that had reflected something in his own experience.
It cost me $200,000. I don't know. I don't know if that's a good motive or not.
Not to mention his friends.
Not to mention my friends, what it cost them. They all contributed freely or willingly or unwillingly they contributed.
What do you think its best use is for now, Al?
I don't know, just keep on doing it. Just to keep on waking people up, let them see themselves for what they are. I think old Carter could stand a good dose of it. And maybe Brown up in the Pentagon, Turner to do him a world of good.
Come sit in here, Albrecht.
Oh, yeah, I'll pop there, don't worry, Tim. I carried out my...
But I do wish you...
I
do wish you'd stop getting in bad.
Getting what?
Getting in bad.
Bad. Well, everything's worked out very well. I'm very respectable like that. The new Rolling Stones, you know, song about talking heroin with the president. We're so respectable. We're so unobjectionable. Nobody's bothering me. Are they bothering you?
Don't bother. Nothing bothers me.
I don't see anyone in this couch that looks being bothered.
If something gets on my back, I get it all. Bill Harmon says there's a nice way to do it. I don't know what the nice way is. Hey, Bill? You say you can be gentle about it.
Yeah.
It's your quote, I'll leave it with you.
Well, I'm very gentle.
We just remember the first time we met, which is in Cambridge, on the night of the Kennedy election.
1960.
In 1960, we went out to this place, and Timothy then was wearing his grey flannel suit and his crew cut, and we had this very interesting discussion with him. And when we went out, I don't think I ever told you this, Timothy, but when we went away, we both said what a nice fellow he is. And he said he's a very nice man, and all of a sudden it's very, very nice to think this work's going to be done at Harvard. He said it'd be so good for it. And then I said to Aldous, I said, I think he's a very nice fellow too, but don't you think that he's just a little bit square? And Aldous said, you may well be right. He said, but after all, isn't that what we want? And Timothy, when I'm discussing the need for understanding human temperament, this is the story I tell, because I said, here Aldous and I both deeply interested in the nature of human temperament, and we meet someone who I think that was probably the least satisfactory description of you ever made, Timothy. I think even your greatest enemies would never make that description. And we made it. We were very, very concerned because we felt that you were perhaps a bit too unadventurous. You see what insight we had.
Well, you sure contributed your part. But
I've always considered myself very square.
Yeah.
So we were right in a way, weren't we?
I always try to hang around the hippest person in the area, and continue to do that. Because I feel that I really basically feel I'm square, and I have very little sense of aesthetics, so I try to hang around the most sophisticated, beautiful people in the world, just so hope some of it will radiate off on me. I have other qualities, though.
You see your career in the sense of self-improvement, and the sort of Horatio Alger's son. No, it was one of the most monumental ill judgments. But it was very, very interesting. We had a very good evening, but we were not able to drink anything because apparently the laws in Massachusetts are such that when an election's on, no one's allowed to drink because of fear that you would corrupt the voters.
Well, all these concepts of the hive concepts of political this or that, I think somewhat irrelevant. I used to say to Sidney all the time, I felt that I was much more conservative than you, Sidney, because I didn't want the government involved in any of our business. I thought that was a pretty free enterprise, staunch.
We each seem to have followed our own paths. You yours, me mine, he his.
Fortunately, since they didn't go in the same direction, a great deal of ground was covered.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess one of the things Oscar might be interested in is what does it all mean and how is it all going to work out and all that sort of thing. And I wonder whether, I know I couldn't possibly evaluate. Anybody want to try?
Nice, I was really interested in your opinion.
Well, I think, as you heard, it stirred people up. It cracked their frame of reference by the thousands, millions perhaps. And anything that does that is pretty good, I think. Anything that shakes people up a little, not too much. Some people maybe it shook up a little too much. That was unfortunate. But in the totality, it may have been a desirable thing at that point in time. The next question would be, well, what's going to happen? And there I think we will see, not soon, but in X number of years, a recrudescence of similar usage here, there, and everywhere. It's happened throughout history, hasn't it?
Yes. So don't you think that the other very important thing is the actual time this has happened? To begin with, as you point out, it's very good for people to be shaken up a certain amount. So far, on the whole, our ways of shaking ourselves up have usually to have real cataclysms. I mean, for instance, the Iranians are being shaken up at the moment. It would appear that many of them might prefer not to be in this kind of way. Because the difficulty with having the great cataclysms is that you end up worse than you began. If one could be able to have a sort of controlled cataclysm from time to time, we'd be much better off, because every society gets set in its ways, and the society with a vast technology is always likely to get to the point when it's simpler and easier and comfier to let the technology take over. And one of the things, it seems to me, that these substances and the attitudes they generate very well is that one becomes less willing to do that, because it's not necessary. You are able. You don't have to look upon your technology as your idol, and it's easy to do this, and it's particularly easy to do this if you've got no way out. It's easy if you're able sort of to separate yourself.
So you think that in days to come, as we become more constricted and more homogenized, that it may be even more necessary to have such...
Much more necessary. But I think it's still very, very necessary, because we are so clever at building all these strange and remarkable things. But then the thing that we stop being clever is that we're very liable then to make ourselves in our own image. I mean, it's extremely interesting, the image of the things we've made, rather. It's very interesting that the mind described by Thomas Willis in 1670 was of a kind of mirror. And the reason why he described that, the mirror was an extremely fashionable new invention. Then the mind that Freud described, if you remember, was a magic lantern. That's where projection comes from. I mean, this was the latest thing. Now the mind
was an indoor plumbing system.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Then the mind became a telephone exchange. Then I gather.
You're ready for that one.
Then it became a kind of television thing, and I gather the latest thing to say it's a hologram. Now the only thing that we know is it's none of those things. The fact is that we've invented all those things, and it's apparently a thing we always do. Now, as long as we don't take it too seriously, but it seems to me one of the things that these substances and the techniques you learn from them is they help you not to take it seriously. Now, with the other people, with other peoples, that none of them have ever managed to make, it seems to me, such an intrusive technology as we've made. It's always been much more difficult. Our technology is sort of marvelously able to do things which would have only tyrants could have done otherwise. Only tyrants could produce vast entertainments for themselves. We get vast entertainments for ourselves whether we want it or not. And therefore we need to have ways of dealing with it. I think Aldous was completely right in both his moralities, in Brave New World and in Part of Ireland, that our needs now are very great, and since it doesn't seem to me that we're likely to dystechnicalize ourselves, because even if we wanted to do that, if we were able to do this, I don't think we can, but suppose we were, no one else is going to do this. So the result of our sort of removing ourselves from the pastoral life would be that someone would come over and take over the continent. They'd be bound to. It would be too much of a temptation for anyone with a technology in being to see us like say the Americas in 1492.
Oh yeah. Listen, but can I interrupt just one second? You mentioned in names. Has it been done yet? I think we should say hello to Aldous Huxley.
Yes.
And to Gerald Hurd.
Yes, we should.
And Alan Watts.
And to Alan Watts, who was the most underestimated of all the philosophers of our time, and they're here with us. And
to say hello to Art Chandler, by the way.
Art. Hello, Art.
Remember Art? Been going back a long way. Yeah. And those of us in those days, I don't know that we fancied what we were heading into. Maybe we might have been willing to call a halt then at the time. But somehow, you know, we were really getting into some things that, from different directions, everybody was finding their own way.
I'd like to say, does anyone here feel that mistakes were made? Or,
Oh, yes. Without making mistakes.
What mistakes were made?
Well, Timothy, estimations in retrospect are in principle unfair. It's really like the chaps, you know, who, when the generals of World War II have large numbers of fellows who were not born at that time, who write interestingly accounts of how the Battle of the Bulge might have been better fought. And it's only too easy.
That's wonderful.
It's only too easy.
Everyone's going to write their own cosmology.
That's right. But I mean, I think that
the world was made in 7 days, but where and when?
Yeah, but I think that those sort of things, one could, I don't say mistakes, what I say, you could have seen other ways of doing it.
My God, quantum physics now tells us that in any second it can go in how many different ways?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's one of the lessons.
So that was a mistake made. Nobody gave it to Nixon.
Well, in order to know whether mistakes were made, you have to know what the goal is. And if you can define a goal, I can tell you whether mistakes were made. I think mistakes were made. But that's my own personal goal.
Well, I'll say one of the goals was to make the American people smarter, raise their intelligence. And I think the American people today are quantum jumps more sophisticated in exactly the general directions in which we all hope they would become more sophisticated, about consciousness, about the nervous system, about the brain, about the options people have in creating their own reality, about self-actualization, self-indulgence, about pleasure being a self-reward as opposed to high reward. My God. Pleasure is now the #1 industry in this country. Recreational travel, entertainment, sensory indulgence. My God, it's now, you know, no question that's our #1. Now, that was my goal.
In this case, you certainly made an advance. Let me put the slightly contrary point of view. This is that we have the awkward thing that we now have chaps like the Ayatollah Khomeini appearing on the scene, but who have the potential of rather different goals. And certainly from where I've been, which you know very well, in the South, these other different goals are always potential.
All right, Pakistan is now going back. We're going to cut off hands for the first robbery and foot for the second. Iran is now going back to...
you know the interesting point about Temple, don't you?
Afghanistan is now...
Pakistan is going to do this, but they haven't been able to get the doctors to do it. Which is, I think, is extremely interesting.
One thing I've learned from the criminal justice situation, there'll always be someone to lop the hands off.
They've got to lop them off now in a civilized way, and they haven't been able to do that.
What was your point, Tim?
Yeah. About the Ayatollah, and
still haven't been able to levitate that yet.
Tim said that he was quite successful in achieving his goals.
Yeah.
Well, I think he's a little presumptuous.
Yeah. Who's my goals? I'm not talking about my goals.
That's right.
I'm totally
withdraw the presumptuous.
Everything they say that's dangerous.
He's optimistic, not presumptuous, and he ought to be optimistic. I mean, it's his natural bent.
But since we all live in these bubbles that we create, we can only basically give ourselves our own report cards at the end of every and so forth.
Take credit for that which we didn't do.
We didn't. Well. Credit, no, I take no credit or blame, but we were talking about goals. See, that's different, isn't it? Credit and blame gets, it's another interesting topic.
So then how would you like to have seen it done? Suppose the scenario had been played as you'd like.
Well, I don't put as high a stock on pleasure, although I enjoy it, as Tim does. I would hope that increased human wisdom might have been an appropriate goal. Increased human humaneness. This I don't quite see as occurring. I don't think we're any wiser. Some of us may be. Maybe if only a few of us are wiser, that's enough. That's sufficient unto the end.
At this point, I would like to apologize to you, Sidney. You were right in most of our debates when you were insisting upon...
I want a copy of that.
Yeah.
Why do you say that?
Well, because you were insisting upon more scientific rigor, and you were emphasizing intelligence, where I was emphasizing consciousness. Now, I think I was robot programmed to do that, so I don't regret doing it, but it was like... it was in the third quarter of a game we played once in the Houston Astrodome when you know, several times, you definitely were saying things. I remember you were quoted in the New York Times after one of our debates as one of the quotes of the week. And it said that you didn't believe that we should be encouraging the evolution of a new species of primates that went around smelling flowers. You remember that quote?
I don't remember it.
Roughly, something like that. And you were right.
I don't know whether I was right now, come to think of it.
Well, but Tim, you know, you and I had an agreement once, too. The last time I saw you, you know, we have our differences of view, and we were a little disturbed that some of the things you were doing and planning would make it more difficult. In fact, even at the time I saw you, it was making it more difficult to carry on legitimate research. And we agreed, you know, if you remember, that, well, Myron, you stay in there and you do the legitimate research, but you need somebody to kind of shake them up a bit. And so I'll shake them up, and then you can take them and show them where they can learn what the right path is. But I didn't know that when you're going to shake them up, you're going to hit them on the head with a ball bat.
Well, I don't accept that metaphor. I have had this experience 4 times in the last 15 years, 20 years. I was one of the younger members of that incredible revolution led by Benjamin Spock, Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, Rollo May, Harry Stack Sullivan, and none of us would be in this room if it hadn't been for the work of these people who are essentially giving conscious psychology back somehow to human access, taking it away from experts, so that I definitely feel that I'm a product of that group, which was essentially a totally American point of view in psychology. They were giving us an American psychology of do-it-yourself, trust your own impulse, you're out there in the frontier, you're having trouble out there, you can't call a Viennese psychiatrist and so forth. Then, in the 60s, we had the same situation. I went farther out in those days than Carl Rogers did. When we were at Harvard in that 50s revolution and so forth, we were giving away the answers to intelligence tests. We were giving away the answers to personality tests. We were doing everything in our power because we felt that the psychiatry at the time was making people more helpless instead of giving them. So we were in a lot of trouble at Harvard, you know, reversing roles. There was Charlie Slack who was paying. He was paying patients more money than he was paying the graduate students. That's one example of hundreds of role reversals in psychology before drugs. Then the drug thing came along, and I had several discussions with Sidney and with you and with everyone saying, and with you too, Al, saying, let us be the far out explorers, and the farther out we go, the more ground it gives the people at Spring Grove to denounce us. So we were like your flankerbacks or whatever it is. And we were the, very runners. Yeah, and I never felt for a second, the hundreds of times that we debated, anything but this wise affection from you, Sidney, that we were somehow, to the best of our abilities, working for human freedom as we saw it, or playing, so that and I felt that the particular role that I was playing then was to, and we never knew what we were doing, you know, in any clear, precise sense, but it seemed always right to us. Then I had the third experience. I was in Folsom Prison when the notion, I began to understand that space colonization was the same issue, that the notion of going into space had been taken over by NASA, by the Pentagon, by the Soviets, and again, it was I wrote Professor O'Neill at Princeton a letter saying, well, my friend, this is the third time I've been through this, and I'm telling you that I'm going to popularize space migration in the next 2 or 3 years, because it's got to be, you know, people in general have got a new generation, young people in college, young physicist students and young sociology students have got to realize that some of the big issues ahead are the control of space got to be taken away from the, you know, the good guy, bad guys who are always the Pentagon and so forth. And now there's a fourth time involved in a situation like this. Genetics, the DNA code and that sort of thing is more important for the next decade, as the brain was. Who's going to control the brain in the late 60s and 70s? Now, I always see my role as the same. I wrote the same letter to Edward Wilson, the very same message that, you know, same discussion that I had, and once in a parking lot with you in Palo Alto. And I wrote Professor Wilson of Harvard. You know, he wrote sociobiology, his new book on human nature, very interesting stuff. I said, look, this is the fourth time. I'm going to do everything in my power to popularize the DNA code, Gaia, wisdom, egg intelligence, genetics, genetic cast, structural cast, and so forth. And I'm going to take it too far. It's going to be radical sociobiology. But I'm not interested in persuading the full professors, the full scientists. I'm going to be talking to the undergraduates and to the high school students, and I'm going to be outrageous, and I'm going to suggest the possibilities of genetic research, so that in 5 or 10 years, when they will have had their PhDs and their MDs and so forth, they'll, you know, because it always happens, it's called neoteny, you always have to send the message to the sexually active pre-adults. And then they will figure out what's right and what's good from all that, and then they'll go ahead and perform it for the functions of society that I have the next generation. So that I see it all as an incredible loving hookup of people playing different roles. And I've never complained or never explained that I know of about being mistreated, have I? I don't think so. And I just wish, I hope that we all understand that we've all been playing parts that have been assigned to us, and there's no good guy, bad guy, or more credit or blame or whatever.
You were, what Gerald Hurd would have said, you were on the cutting edge of things, and that's probably where you belong.
Hey, by the way, Tim, I don't think I ever congratulated you on writing one of the best escape books. I don't know if everyone here has read Timothy's his escape book. It's one of the very good escape books. It was Bantams rather foolishly, I think, over-publicised it and didn't get the thing going the right way. But it's one of the best escape stories I've ever read. I'm something of an aficionado of escape stories, and it's one of the very, very good ones.
Not as good as Papillon.
No, but it's true.
Yes.
The Papillon gives you the feeling that it was being written for a movie. Unfortunately, yours hasn't been made into a movie, but it's a very good one.
Well, I tried to sell the rights before the escape, but Hollywood wasn't ready.
Well, I suppose that would be the best possible move. The movie coming out before you escape.
When the weathermen came up in a car after I escaped, I knew it was the weathermen, and I turned and they had false passports, they had false clothes. I said, "Didn't you videotape this, you fools?" And they said, "No."
Well, here we are.
Yeah. It's a great tribute to Oscar.
Well, but how would you like to have seen it go? And I want to know how Al would have liked to have seen it go, because I think that what we're in here, one has a sort of a temperamental network or grid system in which people were seeing the same thing through somewhat different lenses.
Well, I think we need people like Tim and Al. They're absolutely necessary to get way out, too far out, in fact, in order to move things around. Yes. And we need people like you to be reflective about it and to study it. And little by little, a slight movement is made in the totality. So, you know, I can't think of how it could have worked out otherwise. I must confess that when I studied LSD, and then I heard that it was getting out on the streets, I said, this will never sell. It's too intense. People will be too shook up. But it didn't work that way at all. I'm not quite sure I know why, but apparently people were able to sustain it, this intense response. So my record as a prophet is about one down.
Well, aren't you right, though, if you take a longer range view, because from what I know, maybe I'm not well enough informed, but it's not a popular street drug anymore the way it once was.
I think a fair number of people are still taking LSD, don't you think?
Yeah, but the stuff on the street, you can't call that LSD. That's not LSD.
Oh, wait a minute. Al, perhaps you haven't been assiduous enough in getting the good stuff. I can't believe you failed to find the good stuff.
Well, no, because I had 4,000 bottles of it to begin with.
Yes.
I've never...
You're in the position of a man with an excellent cellar who isn't going around looking at the new...
Because I never sold
You're not looking at the recent vintages to see how they're coming along.
Well, do you think the hippie movement would have come about without LSD or had its impact?
I think that'd be a totally different impact.
What?
It'd be a totally different impact. I don't think, and it would be much less.
I think it was a necessary condition for it, really.
What about heroin? Do you think we would have had a heroin epidemic without LSD?
I don't think it has any bearing on it, Dr. Coleman.
May have had some bearing. I think it had some bearing, but...
Well, it's like saying when you have a CB thing, when you're giving people the concept of self-actualization, they can do things that formerly only experts can do. Naturally, they're going to be...
Well, there's other drugs.
You have a guy Princeton making an atom bomb.
Tim, there's other drugs. There's at least 15 others that act entirely differently. That would still come out that no one's ever said anything about, that we've isolated in the last 10, 12 years, that are far more remarkable than LSD. They really tell you which way you're going. All the harmaline compounds and ayahuasca and all that stuff. We've got all that.
I think another person we ought to mention as not being here, but here is John Lilly.
Yeah.
Well, he will be. He will be.
Oh, he will be.
Yes,
Good.
he'll be here shortly. John
What
will
a
be here.
courageous
And Laura Huxley
person,
will be
huh?
here too. She'll be here shortly. So everybody took their chances, I'll tell you that.
In some ways, I think that John, you know, we all work within the ranges and so forth, but John has gone so far and taken such risks that I just think he's
He'll
a
be
hero.
there when you get there.
Yeah. Boy. Yeah.
You know, Tim, I think everybody took risks in their own way, you know.
Oh, I
and
know.
not just flying around in the Stratosphere one, or, you know, or spending their time in tanks in the other, but there were people who were really working in areas that were very frightening and sometimes very awesome to them, and trying to integrate that and still move along and do what they had to do. And I think people like Art Chandler and so on, and Bill McLaughlin, and Ron Siegel, and others that I look around the room, have had, you know, to walk out on a very, very long, narrow plank, too, and look around. And in their way, I think brought back some very good things, you know.
I think, you know, it's an interesting thing, too. As you go around the country, I'm sure you all have this experience, you talk to middle-aged, fairly respectable people in Tucson, Arizona, and they said, this is where the acid thing really happened. Tucson. In San Francisco, this is where it really happened. The Lower East Side, you know, they say that's where it's really happened. And no one has ever really told the story what was going on in Los Angeles during those years. I think much more was done down here. There was a much wider range. There were more doctors involved. There were more scientists involved.
We had Gerald and Aldous.
Yes, right, yeah. And Ivan, of course. Then, of course, it was part of the coolness of the Los Angeles cell, whatever you want to call it, that they kept a, you kept a...
Well, you might not call it a cell. Let's call it a cluster.
Our undercover agents in Los Angeles were very cool about, and yet they did more in a very laid-back way. And it's never been as public as some of the other, you know, the buses running around the country.
Yeah, and then Zinberg says that the visionary experience and all the things he was doing at Harvard, and the others, his residents and the rest of his giving LSD to, they never had a visionary or an ecstatic or mystic experience, but the whole thing was a California invention, he said. And he said, and the only time it ever happened was when you crossed the Colorado River.
You know, I'm reading John Mark's book on the Manchurian search for the Manchurian Candidate, in which he says that the CIA turned us all on. You know,
well,
but I'd like to get your opinion of what started it. Was it Aldous Huxley's Dose of Perception? Was it Tim Leary? What made the mass use of psychedelics come on, would you say?
Well, notice we have to mention the name of Ken Kesey, and of course Allen Ginsberg was an indefatigable Zionist politician for drugs, and they
But at the very beginning, what would you say? What turned you on, Tim? I don't remember.
And Gordon Watson. Don't ever underestimate the effect of that wonderful, respectable, far-out mind. Yes. In Life magazine, there is a banker, Morgan Guarantee Trust banker, lying on the mud hut of a Mexican, you know, saying wonderful, wonderful. Oh, boy. Talk about Joe Namath commercials.
Sid, we ran close to 1,000 people through, and each of these people were people that had considerable influence in their own right, and they were bringing the message out.
Who turned down Cary Grant? Oh, someone in this room did. But I mean, Cary Grant.
Hartman did, and then I saw him a few times. Yeah. But each of us had, and so this thing was just moving geometrically from people who had large audiences themselves, and the rate of the way inquiries were coming in was geometric after a while. And obviously, if that continued, these people who then couldn't get it from us anymore would be seeking to get it elsewhere.
Yeah.
And it was that kind of a proportion that was taking place. That was, and keeping in mind, of course, that was just a relatively small ripple in a larger pond, but it was carrying a lot of impetus with it. And that might have been one of those things, and then those enclaves joining other enclaves and so on. But I think you're referring to the big explosion, or
the big explosion was when it came out on the cover story on all the popular magazines, Life, Saturday Evening Post, the whole business that were back. They were all.
Well, Alice's book, Doors of Perception, Heaven and Hell, were extremely important among intellectuals.
Yes.
And Frank Barron was another person who was very active in the psychology.
Of course, it was Albert Hoffman who did it all anyway.
I know, right?
Yeah. Your question, I think, really is directed at where did the young people get it? Because that's where the movement started that really spread it across the country.
What do you think about Robert DeRock? That had a lot of effect, where I was. In fact, I was very surprised when I saw
He handled the Mendocino County chapter.
But didn't that Drugs in the Mind have a lot of effect on campuses and stuff like that?
It did. But it was more than just a book or two. There was something in the wind, and I really wondered.
The first major burst of publicity, is that what you're trying to focus on? Is that the
Well, there were steps all the way.
Yeah.
Huxley was one of the first.
After we were fired from Harvard, that fall, every major magazine came out with a there was a cover story in the Saturday Evening Post.
And that
dangerous.
spread it.
There were three different stories in Playboy. So that was it was the firing from Harvard, plus the fact that Henry Luce was somewhere always behind the scenes doing certain things. Plus, so many people have been involved in Los Angeles and so forth. But that was the first big one.
Tim was more responsible than anybody for
Tim,
that.
wasn't it the calculated goal of IFIF to cause that kind of spreading?
Yeah. I remember coming to Cambridge one time when a little article in Time came out.
Yeah.
Remember? And I walked in there and he said, "What do you think about the Time article?" It was really devastatingly bad for LSD. I thought it was terrible, I said. Tim said, "We thought it was great. You let the kids know that there's something here. They'll know it, you know. It doesn't make a difference whether it's bad, good, or indifferent."
Well, I want to point out, though, that the picture, we all know here and now study pictures more than they do long columns. The particular picture, this article in Time magazine attacking our research, had a scientific instrument called the experiential typewriter with all these dials, actually filled with socks, but that's all right. It had an incredibly beautiful young woman sitting, taking the test, and had standing behind her Alan Watts, a beautiful female Hindu guru named Gayatri Devi, and myself. Now, the signal content of a picture like that was much more important than the little words that were being written by some clerk at Time magazine in the medical department. How about McLuhan?
Now, I'm trying to think, though, that what else could happen in a person's life, that short from a religious conversion, that can fire them up with the sort of zeal that we saw in the few people that we began to use it with. In other words, perhaps not everybody went out.
The psychosis.
Yeah. But it was a contagion. It was certainly a contagion.
Contagious psychosis.
It was a contagion. It was a chance. It was a chance for everyone to go to the carnival all at once, you know.
Okay.
And they all came out of that place and they were ready to really spread the word. I'll tell you.
That's true. Talk about
they had the sacrament, and that's how they behaved in those days. Now, that's a pretty irresistible force in terms of public diffusion of information. And that was the kind of zeal that we experienced.
People in this room right now, if we decided to do anything in the next 6 months, that was really right. You know, it was right. It had to be. You know, we could do it.
I'm not so sure. You know, it's amazing how many times the same mistakes are repeated. When I first came to Los Angeles, I was working with Murray Jarvik, who's over here, and
I'm Murray.
we were setting up some LSD studies to do it, and with marijuana, a few other drugs. And Allen Ginsberg came by the lab to visit me one day.
Yeah.
Showed Alan around, and as he was leaving the lab, one of the administrators in the building, it's over UCLA, saw him and allegedly saw someone smoking a joint in his entourage. On the basis of that, there was a big flap. And it was like another Harvard psilocybin fiasco on a much smaller scale. There was absolutely no truth to any of the charges or anything, but you know, it was an uncomfortable situation, anyone wanting to do research with these drugs, even though there was authorization, there was all the DEA forms, there was all the necessary precautions that were taken according to law. There's a lot of resistance to doing those things. And I've encountered that again and again in every university I've gone to trying to set up these studies. And it takes a year and a half of paper. I think Murray took us a year and a half of paperwork.
I think we're in the dark ages.
To get our proposal approved finally.
Drug research of that type.
And the one thing that kept on coming down, they didn't mind marijuana. We were giving marijuana, had 11 hallucinogens listed on the proposal. And the only one that the proposal kept on coming back for was LSD. Yeah. They said, oh, you're going to use LSD, you got to do a follow-up. You got to do a 90-day follow-up, you got to do a year-and-a-half follow-up.
30-year follow-up.
They didn't care about the mescaline, they didn't care about the psilocybin, they didn't care about ketamine, which we can give to children. And it's the only drug that we can give to children without any formal, any hallucinogen that we can give to children without any formal studies.
Well, why is that? Why are they so...
Because it's a normal surgical anesthetic given to hospital patients.
Excuse me, another thing. We're talking about historical moments.
Yeah, right.
The article that Murray and Frank wrote in Scientific American, again, at another level, was one of the Everest points in all this.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Mark.
Indeed. And a man who may come today, who really deserves a great deal of consideration in all this, is Nicholas Purcell. And he may come a little later. He said he was going to be here. Nick is a remarkable man, very quiet and in his own way, went to Europe at the very beginning of all this, and I suspect in writing the book that he may have been the very first person to use LSD in America, although that's often accredited to Wrinkle in Boston. And the reason is that he was sitting, you know, he's a Hungarian, and Hungarians get into rather interesting places. And he was talking to Stoll, the young Stoll, who he said, so he told me, said, by the way, Nick, I know they're talking Hungarian or what, he said, there's a few things I think you ought to try, and he reached into his waistcoat pocket and took out a few vials, and then here, when you get a chance, he said, you may want to try that. And that was before, to my knowledge, before Wrinkle ever got the material, and before they set up a regular program for its distribution in America. So if Nick comes later, I certainly would love to see him, one, and appreciate whatever.
This is like a Grammy Awards session.
It really is.
Category for.
But no, the thing is that now Nick said you saw Nick when he was first starting, didn't you? And he had the material before you did, didn't he?
Yes. He published an article in the Archives of General Psychiatry very early.
Yeah. And then the first article about 7th or 8th in the Sandoz bibliography were attributed to two Americans named Bush and Johnson.
Yes, of course.
In middle America, who just about never showed up anywhere else. And I called Bush and I said, is there really such a person, you know? And he said, yeah. He said, I'm 70 years old, having a marvelous time. I said, hey, I said, did you realize you were the first person to publish in an American journal on LSD? He said, yeah, I guess so.
He came to some of the Macy Foundation conferences, you remember. You were there, I think.
Yeah. And I said, how did you get onto it? He said, I don't know. We got the idea that if we had a good delirium going, he said, we may shake things up a bit, you know. He said, and Johnson and I said, where did you get it? 1940, 50. He said, oh, we just sent the Sandoz. Amazing.
You know Albert's story about that, don't you? About the Sandoz salesman and LSD. Do you know that story? But Albert says that for many years, last time I saw him, he said the Sandoz salesman would come to him and say, "When are you going to get something like LSD?" when we used to go out, for Sandoz, you know, it's quite a small, very respectable Swiss company, and they bring their wares along, and no one would show much interest. But after LSD, when the Sandoz salesman appeared, people would say, "You're the people who made LSD," and they would then pay great attention to everyone and their products. And the salesman looked upon this as being the greatest sales innovation that Sandoz ever made.
Well, there's another side to that story. When I spoke to Burrell, who was the vice president in charge of public affairs in Hanover, I said to him, the usual subject about what happened to LSD. He said, hell, the reason we gave it up, he said, because we couldn't sell it.
But he simply take the wrong view. It wasn't the selling, it was the sales that went with it.
Well, I guess so. But I remember Tim coming to the house one morning, and we were all having breakfast, and Robbie, my boy, was just a little fella, and Tim was wearing a hearing aid. I don't think you remember this. And Rob had never seen a hearing aid, and I dearly loved Tim for this. And he said, Tim had a twinkle in his eye, you know, he looked like a real picaresque, you know, Spanish-Irish kind of a guy. And he said, what's that? And Tim said, well, that's my direct line to the president. so Rob, you know, that was when he was square haircut, you know, and all that stuff, you know. And so Rob said, President? He said, yeah. He said, what would you like to hear from the president? so Rob said, he said, how about no school tomorrow? So he said, sure. And he pulls the hearing aid out and puts it in front of him and he said, President Johnson? Yes. This is Tim Leary here, staying with the janitor. Yes, he said, by the way, he said, the young man here, he said, Rob, he said, he would rather there was no school tomorrow. And the next day was a holiday. and Robbie, and for months, Rob said, is that still ever going to come back? Isn't that great? And I remember old Al Hubbard coming up to the house and with his leather pouch, you know, he used to be he rode the circuit, boy, and he opened up his leather pouch and in it was all the wampum and all the great stuff he had, and he was trading off. Well, he said, what do we have here for the month now, Al? And Al said, well, we've got this and that. Now, something new's coming up. How would you like a little of that? Remember?
Yeah, I remember.
Oh, God, we were waiting for you. We were waiting for you like a little lady on the prairie, waiting for the catalog to see his Roebuck catalog.
Well, I did the best I could with the tools I had.
I know. You had some good
primitive period, Al.
Al, what did you do with that $1 million check that you carried around with you? You had a check you showed me for $1 million. It was the most money I'd ever seen on a check in my life.
That's the most I've seen. It's cost me and other people a lot of money since then.
Listen, I'm not telling tales out because I know you've shown it to others as well as myself.
Well, I think probably it's pretty kind of proud of me, but I finally got down to $100,000. And then, of course, they all went away. This all cost a lot of money because there was no bills to anyone except those that charged for it themselves. That was only a couple of hospitals and 2 or 3 clinics. But all it cost a lot of money.
Was it before inflation or after?
What?
Before inflation.
When Sid wrote his paper on the complications, you remember that? And you sent us a questionnaire about, you know, that was the beginning of trying to assess what kind of care we should take. And I got the paper and I was thinking, what on earth went wrong? And we had a great number of people. But there was one, which I didn't put on that form, Sid, and I have to tell you, one of our people got loose. And I don't know, I have to tell you this now. And we couldn't find him, and this was Wilshire Boulevard. And can you imagine running, and we thought we had the thing well worked out, and the usual babysitter, you know, the routine. And he was gone down Wilshire Boulevard. And we were looking all over, and I thought, my God, if this fellow doesn't come to light, we're in bad, bad shape. So I was coming back to the office and feeling kind of glum about it, when suddenly I hear somebody whistling. And I look around, I don't see anything. I look around, nobody, whistling. And there was a patient sitting up in a tree. I said, what are you doing up there? He said, it's wonderful up there. I said, well, now, don't do anything rash. I said, we'll come again. Oh, no. He said, I'll fly right down and see you. I said, no, you won't. And we had to climb the tree and inch over inch bring you down off the tree. And thank God for that, I'll tell you.
You should have joined him in the tree.
You should have joined. Well, you've been in the tree ever since.
You've been through that one before.
Yeah, climb out of your tree.
Something ought to be said about the check that Al was waving around, because it's taken a long time, but it was just a few days ago that the last steps were taken to see that all the money was repaid. But it was a long battle, but all the money went back to its source.
Is that right?
That's right.
Which money was that, Larry?
Well, don't you remember that? Oh, you had several of them. Thank God I didn't have to get involved in the others.
Funny, you know, I must say to Al's credit that he never made a lot of money selling that stuff at all. He was a great trader, though. He'd say, how about a little almost pure kind of, tetrahydrocannabinol. In those days, you had it was kind of viscous, oil. Remember that stuff in tubes?
Yeah.
He said, now what have you got to offer?
Well, now how do you figure this belonged business, Byron?
What?
Went back to where it belonged. How do you figure it?
From the source.
Huh?
The person who furnished the money got it back.
How?
Well, you know how.
I don't know how.
But it's not a matter for I don't think it's a matter for public record.
Well, I don't know what's different.
They're among friends.
Yes, so between the...
Only Harry is recording it.
$10 million.
One other change in life in connection with LSD, or at least LSD contributed mightily, I think, was the whole upsurge in the study of the chemistry of the brain. I think that had a lot to do with it, and although it may have happened, I think LSD accelerated it.
Yeah, it's interesting that was, in writing the book, that's part of it, that I think the clinicians somehow, if not disdain that, at least somehow that doesn't seem to be an area of terrible concern to them, and namely in terms of of what I think is this equally important impact of LSD, which was on accelerating the entire notion of the neurochemistry of the brain and how the brain processes emotion. And so we're trying to include that, and of course it's going to take a whole other group of people to look at that more critically. But I think, as you say, that chapter is most importantly well worth written entirely. I think it was LSD with serotonin, which in turn gave rise perhaps to the early hypotheses of, of the brain amines in relation to affective disorders. That was a direct chain, to a large extent. Yeah.
I think LSD probably had the most effect on the larger population that has never even taken it, to the marginal participation in the countercultural movement, which I attribute largely to LSD. I'm not attribute it necessarily, but it was, I think, a necessary condition.
Bill, when we were running our subjects, about the third or fourth subject was an artist. And he saw a Kachina doll that was sitting on a shelf, and he said, I must draw something, I've got to look at something, I've got to paint it. So we took the doll off the shelf, and he began to sketch it in, sort of haphazard ways you do, he couldn't control it very well. And when he was through with the experience, he said, this is the most important artistic experience that I've ever had. He said, do you mind if I tell other artists about it. Well, we weren't quite prepared for this. I had no idea that the artist, you know, was going to be any more affected than anyone else. And he then began to bring in his friends, and before long, it was almost as if the entire project would be inundated with artists. That's how completely eager and absolutely interested they were in taking it. And we had to really limit the number of artists. So at least from their point of view, and then we have a very elaborate record of what the artists had said and the follow-up, as you know, because you used some of that data. And the artists seemed to derive an enormous amount of interest and of help from the experience with LSD among all the others. The worst reactors we had were the psychiatrists, and the second were the ministers. I mean, they were not. I mean, you know, there was nothing gravely serious, but they didn't have good reactions very often. The psychiatrists and ministers, and the 2 or 3 rabbis and several. We had, I think, 2 Catholic priests.
But in general, artists have more fun than ministers, don't they?
Well, they may have more fun, but then we're going back to your original thesis.
Do more good then. No, I think they move the human race farther ahead. Artists do, I think.
Well, psychedelic art is still something that has to be evaluated. It's an unproven thing in a way. But we do know that we have 100 pairs of the artists painting the doll prior and painting it afterwards at a time when they had no preconceived notion. Well, some, of course, was accumulating, but not very rapidly. And so we now are processing these pairs to see what can be done or how these people handle it under the drug. And if they took it a number of times, they developed a facility so they could deal with it and they could paint fairly decently under it. You know?
Yeah, that one with the leaf.
Yeah, that one
with the leaf. An old friend of mine sent me a copy of that.
Yeah, I'll have to talk to you.
Yeah, I'd like to understand that a little better with the doll. You say you first had them paint it before they'd taken LSD, and then during.
Yes.
And how about, did you do any after? You know?
Yes. There was some we did after,
Because, I'd be interested there whether they felt that they had some enhanced ability afterward. But they,
Well, what was improved wasn't their artistic ability, by no means. It was just this whole sense of opening up, you know, and having more choices and being able to see things much more, many more permutations and ideas. Would you all like to have something to eat? And we've got a table full of stuff.
Psilocybin,
Yeah. Well, we really don't know.
I think Mary Jeremy.
Because, basically, I was still graduating. I don't know that. We